Oh, sorry about that, guys. We should be ready for your review session. Let me turn those blinds down. Okay, so for our review session tonight, we've only got a few questions to work with, and so I'll work through them as quickly as I can. And then feel free to buzz by and see me if you have any questions tomorrow so we can be able to take care of that. First question first is asking about what the format of the test is going to be tomorrow. Tomorrow you're going to be doing a 25-question multiple choice test, after which you'll be doing a short answer question, and you'll be getting some practice working with those things as we get closer to the AP test. So that'll be our typical format with chapter quizzes from now on. Chapter quiz, then short answer, and we'll be good. Let me see here. And the questions that you'll have on the test are where we left off with Chapter 36 through Chapter 37 up until the Nixon presidency. So we'll be covering the election in 1968 when we get back to class together on Wednesday. The questions that I've got, first one says, what is the Students for a Democratic Society? They're one of the student protest groups that are emerging in the early 1960s that are part of what's known as the free speech movement, where there are many college kids who are mad about the fact that on college campuses they are very much controlled as far as what they can or cannot say, even though a campus is supposed to be a place of open thoughts and free expression. There are many rules on college campuses that would require you to get permission beforehand before you publicly spoke about any issue, and that was being used very much to try to tamp down on civil rights protests, as well as women's rights and other sorts of movements that were taking place. And then eventually it's used to very much press down on the anti-war movement. So the SDS, the Students for the Democratic Society, are going to be one of the groups that is protesting at places like the University of California, Berkeley, and other places against these attempts to try to repress their speech. Many of these kids will oftentimes find their way into things like the Freedom Summer that you guys learned about, with people moving out through out the West to try to sign up voters and register them before the elections take place. And so many of these kids in the early 1960s are going to become the protesters of the late 1960s, especially essential in the anti-war movement. Your next question, as far as the policies, is the New Frontier. New Frontier is the description of the program that JFK is envisioning, like his domestic programs. And so you've learned about a number of these. Teddy Roosevelt had his Square Deal. Then we learned about, during Wilson's time period, we had the battle between new nationalism and new freedom, the two ideas as far as what should be happening with progressivism. You learned about FDR's New Deal, Truman's Fair Deal. The New Frontier is meant to be JFK's big package of programs to try to help out with the country. But he's very limited with what he can accomplish, especially with Southern Democrats throwing up a lot of roadblocks in front of any ideas for civil rights. And Republicans were very much concerned about the growth of the federal government. And so that combination really is going to block him. But his New Frontier is meant to envision a path to space, with hopefully landing on the moon being the culminating point, so that America can surge past the Russians and their accomplishments they've had with like Sputnik and Laika and Yuri Gagarin, and other accomplishments that the Russians have had in space above the United States. The next question I see is asking about flexible response. Flexible response is JFK's new foreign policy strategy that he's going to embrace at the start of his presidency, and it's moving away from massive retaliation. So Dwight D. Eisenhower's idea that we're going to put our money into nuclear weapons, and that will then save us cash and threaten the world. The problem is that's bringing us really close to nuclear war, as you guys saw with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in particular, a lot of the wars that are starting to pop up aren't gigantic thermonuclear wars. Instead, they're more like insurgent wars, where if we're trying to contain communism or trying to slow down the spread, nuking a huge part of the country is going to guarantee that these people become our enemies, and then it could trigger World War III. So flexible response is the creation of a bunch of different layers of military intervention, ranging from regular military and nuclear weapons all the way up to a new brand of special forces. And the nickname for them is going to be the Green Berets. They're going to be our elite military forces. They're trained in counterinsurgency and all sorts of subversive sort of sort of activities where they're going to be able to infiltrate places and do things militarily that are meant to be ground level and guerrilla style. That's where you see a lot of the effort going in during the Vietnam period, where America starts sending in what they call advisors. These are Green Berets, and so they're being sent into Vietnam to train the South Vietnamese military when they're trying to defend South Vietnam against an invasion by the North. But many of these people are also fighting when they were supposedly just advising the Vietnamese. Next question I see is about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis is simple. We sent a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba, and they found that there were nuclear installations where they were building nuclear launching pads that would be able to deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States within 90 minutes, giving the Russians first strike capability, which means they could hit the United States with weapons that could blow up a huge portion of the country before we'd ever be able to respond. And then they theoretically could end up winning a nuclear war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, America is going to quarantine the country, which is a blockade, but he doesn't want to call it a blockade because Kennedy's worried that that could lead to a nuclear war. And so instead, we're going to throw a quarantine around the country, stop any ships from getting into Cuba. And fortunately, the Russians were willing, after a couple weeks, to back down and pull their nuclear weapons out of Cuba. The lasting impact, though, that we had with the Cuban Missile Crisis is the recognition that they did have nuclear weapons that were armed and ready to go. And so thankfully, JFK resisted the impulses of his military leaders to go in and do stuff that was pretty aggressive. So the deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba is going to get rid of their nuclear weapons. We're going to promise that we're not going to try to invade Cuba anymore, kind of like we did with the Bay of Pigs crisis, and we're not going to try to assassinate Castro either. And then we're also going to pull our nuclear weapons out of Turkey, which is about the same distance from Russian targets as Cuba was from our targets. And so we're trying to de-escalate the tensions between our two countries. You're also going to have a ban that's going to be coming up on above-ground open-air nuclear testing that seems pretty provocative. Because it's tempting one another to try to outdo each other. Next question I see here is asking about the European Economic Community. You learn about this right after World War II. It's created by Truman, and this is going to be an organization of economic decision makers where they're going to be discussing what they should be doing with trade to try to open it up between the European countries that are not part of the Russian Confederation. And so what we'll see is with the European Economic Community, they're going to start banding together, trading with one another, getting rid of trade barriers, getting rid of tariffs, and they're going to start rebuilding their economy pretty quickly. This will eventually become the European Union. And if you've heard about Brexit, Brexit was the decision by the British recently to remove themselves from this organization that was created decades earlier in an attempt to try to provide not just military protection, but in this case, this is meant to economically strengthen these countries. So instead of being individual, they gain the benefits of being able to trade with a lot of partners in a small space. Next question is, what was the Kerner Commission report? Kerner Commission report is a report that was created at the end of the Lyndon Johnson presidency, right after Martin Luther King's assassination, to try to examine why is it you saw so many race riots breaking out in so many cities during our documentary today. The realization that happened with the Kerner Commission is that inside the United States, you had established segregation, that even though de jure segregation was over, they've outlawed with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, they've outlawed any explicit segregation. You still have segregation that's been built up by decades of practices, both from World War I and World War II, and even predating that. And now our segregation is not based on skin color, although there's still people who are refusing to sell and whatever in the 60s and 70s in a racist practice. But you're also going to have people disqualified from moving out of their neighborhoods based on economics. They're not going to have enough money to move into a suburban neighborhood. And the jobs that they could pursue for that left the inner city to go to the suburbs as well. And so what they find with the Kerner Commission is that there is segregation that is entrenched. There is poverty that is pretty widespread. And they also discovered that there are practices happening inside the city with police officers and others that are fostering this feeling of segregation and two-class citizenship. And so the advice that the Kerner Commission gives is to dig deeper into this and try to rectify the situation. What we'll find in the 60s and 70s, though, is largely the only civil rights advances that are going to be taking place from this point forward are going to be through court cases that are trying to challenge resistance to the currently existing laws. But there aren't a lot of new laws that are going to be added through the 60s and 70s. But some of them that they do create, like affirmative action and other sorts of decisions, are going to be highly controversial, and it's going to be very divisive inside of our country about whether or not they are the right or wrong course that we should be taking for civil rights. And we'll be examining that coming up over the next week when we look at the 1970s. Let me see here. Is the test on everything in 37? Do I know what page we stop at on 37, or a term to stop at? I showed you that today in class on the slide to begin the class period. It was the one that deals with right after the 1960s counterculture movements. You're going to stop before, your test tomorrow is going to stop before the 1968 presidential election. So anything with the 68 election of Nixon is going to be rolled into your next test, and your next test is going to be covering chapter 37, the remainder, and chapter 38 on the 1970s, and it'll take us probably about a week to be able to cover that material with some writing included in that as well. Looking at my questions, I do not see any other questions that are up here on the screen. So hopefully you're in good shape. I'm assuming that you are now locked and loaded and ready to go with your study methods, and so I'm hoping you are finding good success, and I'm hoping tomorrow's test goes well for you. But feel free to email if you do have any other questions that I haven't covered tonight. Thanks a lot. Have a good night.